That's not mine. I don't know if someone has forgot their clicker. Maybe the last presenter.
I think this was ours.
Yeah. Someone.
You want the wireless mic?
Yeah, of course.
Just make sure, try to position it so that you're not touching this as much as possible.
Okay.
This is ours. You can use it if you like.
No, that's fine.
No?
Is it HDMI only?
No, there's. Do you have HDMI?
Oh yeah, we do.
Okay. There is USB-C.
Give me a couple of seconds here. Okay, Mike.
Yep. Just give you a quick intro while you're doing that.
Yeah, of course.
All right. So for our next talk, we have Alex. Correct me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Argeris. Argeris. There you go. Alex Argeris. And we're going to be having some prizes after this, so stick around.
Can you guys hear me well? Mic is perfect. Let's start. Let's go ahead. So, if I remember correctly, this summer, I did look at LinkedIn and I saw a post from Robert saying, thanks God, right? BSides is coming back on track in person. So, okay, what the heck I'm going to present this year? I'm not quite sure. For those of you who know me, I've been a security analyst at Bell Canada for many years. And then I moved into the obscure world of sales with Cisco 8 years ago. So my core business is typically threat from endpoint, email, and network security in general. So 2 or 3 years ago, I decided to move as well to another world, which is DevOps or Sec DevOps, right? With XDR. So with this, it comes everything related to API, of course, right? We tend to integrate everything with API. So when I saw the post from Robert, I say, okay, what the heck I'm going to present this year? And I say, okay, I think I'm going to talk about API. First of all, I'm not an expert on API security at all, okay? So I did some research and prepare to be able to build that slide deck. So hopefully for the next 30 minutes or so, we will have a nice discussion on API security. And of course, I came up with a great title. Pretty sure you guys are, or at least if someone has asked me a couple of years ago or even last year, what is the most or the threat vector, right? The most threat vector that is used by cyber criminal and so on and so forth, I would say email, right? But I'm not quite sure if this is going to still be email in the next couple of years, right? It may be API in reality. So let's try to figure this out. So just a little bit about myself. For those of you who don't know me, as I said, I work for Cisco as a security analyst, or not security analyst, sorry, sales engineer, focusing on security. And I've been presenting at BSides for many years, thanks to teams of BSides, on multiple different subjects, from DNS sync calling, crypto, SSL decryption or not, a couple of those one as well. A fun topic, of course, right? So I like to do skiing over winter. Big fan of road bike as well. And I have very nice family, okay? You're lucky, that's part of the story as well. You're lucky because every year B-side is exactly the same week of my birthday wife. So it's always like, am I going, am I not? So at the end of the story, I'm gonna fly tomorrow morning with the fly at 5 a.m. back to Montreal. That's that's the end of the story. Anyway, so typically I consider my talk as sexy, right? Or fun, right? Funny with some videos and all that, reference to some external stuff that are nice to look at and stuff like that. But unfortunately, API is not sexy at all. It's almost boring at some point. Right? So let's try to see what we can come up with for the next couple of minutes here. So a couple of warning here, of course. I'm here on my own, right? I'm not representing Cisco at all. And please, typically I would say, please ask questions. So it's going to be boring. But this year, I'm going to say, you know what? Don't ask too much question. I'm not a security expert on API. Instead, add comments, right? Raise your hand. Say, if Alexandre, you're totally wrong, right? That's not what's going to happen in the next couple of years. Or here's that, the reality of API and so on and so forth, right? So I can be able to learn from you guys, and you also going to be able to share that content as well, or that knowledge with the other folks in the room as well. Make sense? So first of all, I do have a ton of pigs here. Those of you who are familiar with the snort pigs. I didn't know until I walked here what I was going to do with it, but I always have a dream to be able to throw those one, right, in a room. So if Caddy, one for you. Oh, Caddy, one for you. Oh. So if you guys had any comments that are nice, right, I will do it as well. Ken, one for you over there. Or if you want any of those one after the talk, I'm sure you're too far. Oh. I'm sure that we will have a bunch of those one available at the booths as well. Okay. So let's set the table. Okay. Make sure that everyone is on the same page. So first of all, when we talk about API, those statistics essentially are based on a couple of research that I did. They are all available, of course, and I have the reference at the bottom of the page as well. And I was very, very impressed by that number on the top. Okay, it's in 2021, so I guess that number has probably increased a lot as well in 2022. But I don't know about you guys, but at home I have 3 children that are almost all teenager, and when I look at my firewall the statistic, it's more roughly 99.9% of TikTok, YouTube, and Netflix, and so on and so forth, and not API. But in reality, if you look at traffic, apparently the vast majority of the traffic over the web is API. Okay, so what do we do with that? Okay, and other statistics that are pretty interesting to look at as well. This is from Radware. They say that most of the organizations are seeing a lot of increase into the usage of API. Okay, so my guess is all your organization are probably using a lot of API to do all kind of funky stuff with it. So this statistic is pretty interesting as well. If you look at that, it's from Salt Security, based on a report that or survey that they did. If you look at the percentage of those API attack over the last year, comparing the increase of API traffic and overall for the same period, it's crazy, right? So that's one of the reasons why I think API is probably going to be a very big problem for us in the next couple of years. if you look at the other statistic as well, we're almost 100%, 95% of the respondents said that they have been suffering from a potential threat leveraging API as a vector, right, essentially. So there's a bunch of number over here as well if you look at that text. But essentially, the most important thing in my mind is the documentation, right? Or having API that are well known by your organization, or API that at least are known by your organization, right? It's mean that most of the organization do have API that are leveraging probably on a daily basis that they do not know. Right? So what about if that API is vulnerable, for example, has a security patch that needs to be applied, or so on and so forth? So who here thinks that microservices and container or whatever SaaS application or even low-level API are secure by default? You're totally reason. I'm sure that they are not. Right? Typically, and if you look at most of the product out there, and I consider my product at Cisco or any other product as well from any other competitor, they are made to be simple. Right? So by default, we do not apply too much security. Right? So typically, we will say, go ahead and apply this and that to make it more secure. Same thing apply here with the API. That's my guess. If you look at the other statistic as well, it said that open source code are more secure. I will tend to say yes. Right? It's all depend perspective. Some people will say no. Some people will say yes, of course. But if you look at open source code, typically there's a bunch of people that are looking at that code, the source code, and make it better. So let's take a setback and let's look at the base of what API is. I'm pretty sure there's some of you may, but don't really know what API is. Okay? So if you look at that description over here, which is coming from media, it's a little bit old, and I would say that it's not totally true anymore. Okay? It said that API is typically a way to communicate between two services, two application, two server, right? Without having a human interact into the communication itself, right? It's not intended to be used for user interface, so on and so forth. Not anymore so far. I think that if you're using a browser with extension, you have application on your iPhone, Android devices, there's a great chance that behind the scene, a lot of API is used to produce that content that you're viewing on those applications or you're viewing on those extensions in your browser as well. Okay? So there's mainly two big API, or I would say type, right? REST API and SOAP API. I have not dealt with SOAP API at all. So if there is anyone down here that have been dealing with SOAP API and still do some development around it, good for you. But the vast majority of the population around the world are more tend to are more using REST API itself. If you're looking at REST API, it's more based on a web type interaction. Okay, it's leveraging, and we will look at that a little bit further. It's leveraging HTTP method that we're used to typically, and it's used as well JSON file that most of the programmer, coder, or whatever are familiar with to exchange data, whether to ask for a control, ask for a command, or to get a response from a specific request. Comparing to SOAP, where it's used the old XML, and most majority of people don't like as well. This is probably a very old 2020 statistic, but whatever. It's just to show you the difference between the usage of SOAP versus REST API versus the rest of the type of all the other type of API. Okay. HTTP or API HTTP method, we're pretty used to the first one, all right, GET. But there's many more. And the reason why we're used with the GET one is because when we use our browser, I would say probably 99% of the time, we do. So we are asking for some content on our browser using a GET, and then we expect some response from the server. Most of the time is HTML content to be displayed into our browser. Same thing apply here with API, right? So we're using the GET requests for some content to be shared with us. And there's as well. So POST typically will be for command, right? So if we look at a server or application or router or a firewall, then we will POST to change some type of configuration within the devices itself. There's put and patch, right? So if we want to change something in a database or update something, then we will leverage the or patch HTTP method. And then the last one, delete, of course, it's the one that we want to use if we want to remove some content from a specific application where we're using our API. So let's look at the API security challenge. Some of you may be familiar with the OWASP, right? Probably, some of you, right? There you go. I see someone knocking his head over here. Oh, too far. Anyway. I have, and there's one guide, specifically there's one guide for top 10 on API, okay? So those are the guide to identify some type of vulnerability that can apply to some sort of system. And I have choose to look at specifically at 6 or 5 different vulnerability, and we will go over them in the next couple of slides. So the first one is broken access control. So of course, same thing apply here. So based on the last talk where we were talking about zero trust and identity, so on and so forth, same thing apply here with API, of course, right? So typically when you will create an API set key, which is typically a secret or whatever, then you will also assign a role to that API set key, right? Or a key set. Whether it's a view role only, admin role, or whatever other role that you will have also set or created within your application. Pretty important to test that, right, at some point, right? Make sure that if you create an API key that is supposed to have only view access, then this API key cannot do a delete on any of your data within that application, right? Test it. Same thing apply as well with the evolution of privilege or being able as well to do things like manipulating the data if you're not allowed to, right? Security misconfiguration. So like most of the technology out there, there's always default configuration, okay? Sometimes default configuration are not the best. And even if here we're talking about API, there is still application that leverage API that has a web access for admin, right? So make sure maybe that the default user and password has been changed. Things like the one that I like over here, it's the error handling. So if you're creating your own API, or if you're testing an API, it could be a good thing to look at the error that API is giving back when you're, I don't know, doing a bad request, right? So you want to make sure that that error handling message is not telling too much, right? Just enough for the developer, for example, to be able to fix that request, and not more, nothing more. Of course, it's all about updated complement all around that API, and it's including as well the layer of application where that API is, right? It could be the physical box, it could be the OS, and so on and so forth as well. So make sure to patch all this system, make sure to apply correct fix, upgrade it, so on and so forth. Identification and authentication failure. So, of course, there's multiple things that could apply here. I'm pretty sure maybe you have been, you're familiar with URL where you see session ID within the URL itself. And even worse, sometimes you will see API key directly into the URL as well. Some people will say, we don't need to worry about that. It's HTTPS. It's encrypted, right? Okay, but what will happen if that traffic go to a proxy that do SSL encryption, right? Everyone that is access to the log will see the API key within that log. Okay, that could be an issue here. So the other one as well is how frequently you change those API key, right? Back to the previous talk on Zero Trust, where we were mentioning MFA, for example. So we're pretty good now these days doing MFA control, right? So we ask all our employees to use MFA for almost any type of connection or authentication to all our application that we have. But we're pretty bad of doing something similar with the API key. And worse than that, typically when someone are asking us to get an API key, we will either send that API key and the secret to email, to Teams, or whatever other channel that we're used to use, right? And we will never change it. That's the worst part. The other thing as well is people will leave their API key within script, and they will publish those scripts on public GitHub or other public repository as well, right? Don't forget, typically when you publish something on GitHub, it's almost there for life, right? So that could be pretty bad. So logging in general, I'm a big fan of logging, of course, but important things, don't log everything. Security stuff is pretty interesting to look at, including auditing logs, access logs. There is some commercial offering that can look at all that data and trying to detect a bad behavioral tentative of connection, of course. Am I missing one point here? No, I'm not. So an extra one here, and that's coming from my network background, right? DDoS, right? Denial of service, which is not part of the top 10 from OWASP, but I think it's still one that is pretty important to look at as well. So you want to protect the access to those API resources, of course, right? If you are, for example, a competitor of you that is mad at you, it could try to DDoS your access to your API, right? That could a service that is degraded or even available for your own customer, okay? So that could be pretty bad. The other thing as well with DDoS or with scraping in general, for those of you who do understand that word where we do scraping for web information, you can have your competitor that leverage that API to scrape all your data, right? That is publicly available to take advantage of maybe price that you're giving to your and try to see if they can sell it for cheaper, of course, in real time, almost real time. API documentation, which is another one as well. I think it's missing into the top 10 one from OWASP. So there's two types of documentation for, I would say, for API. the one that are public and the one that are private. So most of the API that are public do have that are publicly available. And the reason is pretty simple. Like if I'm a customer of AWS, I want to be able to leverage their API, of course. Same thing for Microsoft, any other Salesforce, whatever other SaaS provider that is giving a service. So the documentation needs to be publicly available for sure. But in this case, I doubt that there's a lot of problem within those API, those documentation. There's probably a bunch of people that went through and find all the different issue with it. But on the other hand, if you're building an in-house application that is leveraging API, and think about it, should you publicly expose your API documentation, right? I don't know. Maybe it could be part of your business, maybe not, right? If this API is just leveraged internally, that it maybe doesn't make sense to publish that API documentation. Make sense? So the other part as well is Swagger. So for those of you who are not familiar, wow, I'm trying this. Someone was asking one over there. Oops. Oops. So the Swagger is another one that is pretty interesting. So for those of you who are not familiar with Swagger, it's typically the diagram of all your API tree, right? It's helped a lot for developer to look at all that. It's kind of a documentation as well that can be leveraged by many different people to do good things or bad things as well, right? So again, if there's no requirement for you to publish this to the outside world, keep it for you. So now it's time to learn a little bit. So if you're not familiar with API, here's your chance. Okay, the easiest way to start with API is to use your regular browser, and that's it, right? Instead of having an HTML content showing in your browser, then you will have the JSON result from that HTTP request, which is an HTTP request to get detail on a specific IP over here, which is Google. Okay. Of course, you're not going to be able to do all kind of fancy API requests with your browser. A start. If you want a little bit further than that and start to play with free API, there's a ton of free API available on the internet. Okay, that are always on. Things that are from weather to price on stuff to jokes, cats, picture, and all that. There's tons of those API that are publicly available. Like if you look at Rapid, I think it's Rapid API. They have a way to search through those one. So you can subscribe to some of those API and leverage it into your own project if you want to. If you want to start playing with your own API, for example, test your own API as well, or even those API, I strongly suggest to use Postman. So Postman is kind of the tool to be used, right? If you want to go a little bit away from CLI and the Linux shell or whatever other shell that you're using with Python, then you can leverage Postman for that. Okay. The great thing about Postman, there's a lot of organizations that are creating their own API, creating as well, right? That can be downloaded, and all these packages include endpoint, so which is URL for all their API. Any questions so far? Who wants a pig? So the next thing here is to those top 10 OAuth vulnerability. So unfortunately, I have not been able to test it myself, but that tool seems to be updated. So a couple of months ago, so I guess it's not too old. So essentially, it's a Docker that has its own API that has a ton of vulnerability, typically associated to the top 10 of OWASP. So if you want to test that, that's a cool way to do it, right? Start with it. And of course, the question, right? Do I test this in a production environment? The answer is always, it's up to you, right? Yeah, some people will say no. Some people will say, I don't have the luxury or I have no choice, right, to do it in production because I don't have that API elsewhere. So totally, it's up to you. I will say it's depend if the API itself is critical to your organization. If it's critical, then it may be a good thing to wait until midnight or whatever other time of the day that the API is not as used by your customer or your user or whatever server or application that is leveraging the API itself. Okay. So a couple of tools over here as well. They're all open source tools that are available through GitHub or any other type of repository as well. I have not tested those one, and some of those are pretty old as well. But the key here is these are all tools that will help you to test your own API or API from your SaaS provider or from your iOS application as well that you have in-house. There's a reference over there as well for the list. Most of those applications will require you. Unfortunately, it's not a one-button test. Okay, so most of these tools will require you to add some content to be detected, right? Please look for this, please look for that, and stuff like that. Okay, but at least it's a good script or tool that will allow you to go through all your application or API and figure out if there is any type of vulnerability through it. There is also other tools that are not shown here that are commercial tools that will do similar things, of course. Some of them sometimes are part of a vulnerability scanner, product, and so on and so forth. One tool that I have tested myself, and this one is pretty nice, it's how to find API key that could be lost in the wild, right, essentially. So do I have any of my developer that has left any API key on a script and save that script on GitHub repository, for example? Okay, so this tool it's based on pattern. So there's a list of already populated pattern, but you can also add your own pattern as well that would look for pattern of API key, and essentially will go through all a list of URL where you have your repository of script for organization or for whatever other reason as well. And it will go through all these scripts and try to figure out if there's any API key that are left within those scripts itself. Make sense? So almost at the end. Takeaway. So please make yourself familiar with API before it hits you, of course. Be better at visibility, increase the visibility that you have on your API that you're leveraging at your organization. Document all these applications as well that may use API without your knowledge. And use some open source or commercial or whatever tools to test those API for vulnerability. Okay? Any comments? Any questions?
A lot of vendors that offer WAF, web application firewall, that includes an API protection. There's also another portion that comes from bots. Bots can also attack your APIs. So you can also look at bot management solutions, make sure they have API protection that will look at the trends, how your APIs are used normally.
Yep, I do agree. So there's a lot of API gateway now these days. So typically an organization that has a lot of API will try to forward all these API or proxy all these API through an API proxy. In this case, you can have multiple different look and inspection as well at that enforcement point. Hopefully it was useful for you guys, and see you next year.